Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Insidicast. Today we're going to be tackling 3-in-1 triple Christmas threat, the 1974, 2006 and 2019 films Black Christmas.
Expanded his act. Could that be one person? No, Claire, that's the Mormon Tabernacle Choir doing their annual obscene phone call.
Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Insidicast. It's me again, Phil, your host. Today we're going to be talking about Black Christmas, all three films, which is 1974, 2006, 2019, how the original set premises for many films after it, and how the later installments of this version sort of successfully or maybe fail to live up to that original. Basically, we're going to talk about just the original real quick. I'm not going to do like a full breakdown of the 1974 version and sort of my thoughts and feelings about everything that happens within the film. Generally, this is just my personal take. I think the 1974 film is pretty average, if not pretty less than average. It's a very standard film. I can see why it got the cult classic that it did. But I think, honestly, most of the credit from the original film came more from the fact that it inspired Halloween in many of its stylistic nature. You know, it was sort of the first film that kind of introduced that stalking serial killer who had a lot of voyeuristic camera angles and point of view lenses of the killer looking in at victims that kind of inspired a lot of the slasher genre that came after it. I think it came out in 1974, so it came out 4 years before Halloween. And if you've ever done any kind of in-depth study or analysis into Halloween, you know that Black Christmas was somewhat of an influence on that nature of filmmaking. However, I think the film in general was just pretty average. I think it kind of was just treading new ground, and therefore, like, there was no pre-established thing before that. And I think Halloween set in stone a lot of the horror movie tropes that we expect for slasher films. So, in general, I think it was pretty average. I think it did a pretty good job at setting some creepy nature. I think it set the phone calls as being an integral part to this film franchise, I guess, in general. But I think, obviously, the main thing that it does set in stone is many of the classic slasher tropes, such as a serial killer who stalks young teenage girls who are probably alone. A lot of emphasis on complex issues with family and motherhood and the mother-child relationship, which seems to be quite a common thing when it comes to slashers. Think about Psycho, for example, really good example. Jason as well in Friday the 13th. Obviously, I think this has probably given it a kind of heightened recognition, especially from cult followings, that basically, you know, it's kind of like one of the best or greatest horror films ever made. Not saying that it's not, it's just personally for me, I didn't think it was that interesting. I think without the context of the things that it was able to do, it's generally just pretty average on its own. And I think, you know, many things that have come after that are on like a pretty similar caliber. I think it is one of the films that is more praised just because of what it established for later things than, you know, itself. It does do a pretty good job at like setting some claustrophobic horror, some voyeuristic sort of serial killer kind of vibe, and it is really creepy. And obviously the phone calls that they have in there are much more visceral and much more like detailed and graphic than any of the phone calls that are in the later installments, especially the 2019 one, because there was basically no phone calls in that. We're going to get into that, and it was a bit of a mess. But obviously, I think one thing that made Black Christmas establish itself more as being more culturally impactful was the fact that it came out in the 70s. And the 70s, for people that don't know, there was quite a big emphasis on stranger danger. This was being pushed by multiple different countries and in multiple different narratives about the worries of speaking to strangers. And it was kind of the breakdown of a lot of idealistic, not only cinema, but idealistic ways of living, where like people could just leave the door open and like it's okay that people can talk to strangers, and it's all just like this community nature. And there was a much more heightened sense of danger towards people that you don't know, even around places where you live. And I think this is culturally probably what impacts a lot of the worry about neighbors, and how people like don't really associate with neighbors anymore. And there's always like this kind of push, like, oh, we need to go back to more like neighborlyhood communities, which I don't disagree, but I think the 70s was a massive impact of why a lot of that stuff broke down. And I think Black Christmas itself was specifically inspired by some events. I think it was in Quebec in Canada, about the kind of urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs. Interestingly enough, as we'll talk about in the 2006 version, When a Stranger Calls was also a factor of this, and When a Stranger Calls was also released again, that remake in 2006, playing on those same types of tropes. Just kind of depends on whether a lot of that stuff is still felt the same way that it was back then. And in many ways, like, it isn't. I think it's hard to ignore the fact that, like, crime these days, although it does happen, is a lot harder for people to get away with things, especially because a lot of crimes, in the past, when you think about like stranger danger and stuff like that, a lot of that stuff would have been done in the open. Like more, just kind of more publicly, whether that's approaching people or approaching children or like any kind of like, creepy scenario. It's much harder to get away with that stuff now, just because the amount of surveillance that is around. It's really hard to get away with stuff being done in broad daylight like it used to be. And therefore, like, I don't know how much of an impact this still has on people. And maybe that's kind of why opinions of that changed over time and kind of skewed. And I think that's probably why the 2019 went in on a completely different angle, because it's hard to strike those same kind of vibes anymore, because the world is much more integrated, everyone's connected to each other. It's hard to do anything without people seeing it anymore. Like, despite the fact that people broadcast their lives more, people get broadcasted. People take videos of other people, whether that's in the streets or whatever. It becomes very, very difficult these days to have that kind of stranger danger feel, because we're all so integrated with each other. I think one of the things, though, that does give the 1974 version a bit more of like a shining glory for me was obviously the end word Jess is sort of still ambiguous. Still don't quite know what would happen to her. I think a lot of films like don't do that enough these days, especially in horror films. Everyone kind of either has justice served, or somehow things just continue. Like, they just find a way of just recontinuing. Like, you kill the killer and the killer comes back. You know what I mean? Or like people survive until they die, and it's you never get like a lot of ambiguous sort of scenarios anymore in kind of horror films, where like you don't know whether someone survived or not. You don't know whether the killer actually died or not. Everything these days seems to be a lot more like permanent, and I think it's probably because it's more money driven than story driven, right? So like, if you want a sequel, if you want franchises, you don't want to kill off the killer. I think in many ways, like, Halloween suffers from this, where like, as much as they try, they can't kill off Michael Myers. Like, I think it's literally in the contract that he's not allowed to die. So many times that they have done, it's been very ambiguous, but of course they always bring him back, because you can't kill him, because it's all about the franchise. And I think maybe Black Christmas then just kind of benefits from it being quite low budget, quite, unheard of, because it was just the first of its kind, that it could focus a little bit more on the storytelling and allow some open-ended things for people to fill in the blanks. Definitely would love to see some more of that, but I think it definitely relies on cinema being trusted more in the hands of directors, and letting them call more of the shots about things that happened. I guess in a way, like, the closest we'll get things these days is maybe like Ari Aster's films, where I think at the end of like Hereditary and the end of Midsummer, those are pretty open-ended, especially on terms of what's going to happen to the main characters, what's going to happen to the world that they're now in, and people within that. It's very rare these days that directors are trusted with that type of freedom in storytelling. So I guess like that's just my quick summary of the 1974 one. If people really want me to go into more depth about it sometime, do let me know. I will go further into it. But I'm just gonna like go in chronological order, saving the worst for last. But first, we'll talk about the 2006 version of Black Christmas.
Why are you bothering putting with those cookies? Santa ain't coming to see you. The Russians shot his sleigh down. Santa Claus is dead.
So to kind of sum this up in a very like brief way, the 2006 version of Black Christmas is pretty good. I think the problem that the film has had in terms of trying to reach massive success is, one, the timing of when this film came out. 2006 was a very, very awkward year. If you look at a lot of the film releases, a lot of remakes happened this year. Not only Black Christmas, which is technically a remake, but you had The Wicker Man, which is technically a remake. You had Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was either a remake or another version of that story. You also had The Hills of Eyes, which was a remake of the original. You had When a Stranger Calls, which was also a remake. And then obviously it was coming up against big hitters that, you know, were going to come out anyway, that was going to be very difficult to fight against in terms of being any way recognized. You know, you got the Pirates of the Caribbean films, very successful. X-Men, I think The Last Stand came out that year, very, very successful. And then talking like the Final Destination 3, which two of the actors from this film are in that as well. The main actress and I can't remember the one with the blonde hair in Final Destination, one of the two girls. Also, you had Saw, which was obviously a very big franchise at the time. I think it was the third film of Saw that came out that year. So, you know, you're up against a lot, and there's a lot of remakes, and a lot of people can get pretty tired of remakes because, you know, it's hard to justify like why sequels should be made, but sometimes it gets very hard to justify like why we should do like a full reboot or a full remake, because people just automatically assume it's for money. You know, that kind of puts people off. Like, people want to go into a film because they want to have like a good time and a good story, and they've created this thing because they want to retell the story, not just because they want to cash in on a franchise that maybe has been dead in the water, or because cinemas want to keep hold of licenses. So when the ending of a license happens, studios have to like create a new film in order to like renew that license. And this is why like you get things like Hellraiser, where they just release trash films after each other, but it's because the studio doesn't want to let go of the license to Hellraiser, right? So otherwise then other studios can come and get it. Or it might go back to like the original people who created X franchise. It's kind of greedy in a way, but it does mean that like we get these really bad films every now and then, and it really like puts a sour taste in people's mouth. You know, where it's like, oh, why do they keep making these films? Because they're rubbish. But alas. So we'll talk about the 2006 version of Black Christmas. I mean, it should basically be renamed to Black Eyes. The only thing that this film is obsessed with is eyes, removing eyes, black eye sockets, people eating eyes, pulling out eyes, stabbing eyes through heads and poking eyes out. I think this was a very weird trend that I remember happening a lot in the like early 2000s. There's a lot of films that were obsessed with this type of stuff. I think Hills of Eyes was another one. Lots of films were just obsessed with eye pulling and poking. I don't know if this was just like some new prosthetic feat that they just established in a time period, and every cinema was like, oh my god, we need more eye poking and pulling. At least sometimes we've got some creative kills in this film, and it would have been nice to see a little bit more of that, because I mean, I don't remember this being a trend in the 1974 version where like everything was about like eye pulling, so it just seems kind of weird that this film was just obsessed with it. It almost kind of made it like an integral part of the plot, because obviously Agnes had an eye pulled out by Billy, you know, and it was like, well, now we need to just obsess about eyes for the whole film, which is just very, very bizarre. When this film starts, one thing it does is it really does establish itself as a Christmas film, and this is something that the 2019 version doesn't do. The 1974 does do this, but I think this really like goes balls to the wall. Like, this is Christmas, you know. Like, I think pretty much like the only lighting that we see in most of the film is from Christmas lights and Christmas tree lights and lights that they put all around the house. There's tinsel everywhere. There's music all the time. I think it was the Nutcracker theme gets played like 50 million times in this film. And obviously presents are a big one, a returning part of the plot anyway. And it's, pretty successful at driving home that this is a Christmas film, which you kind of need, especially when a lot of this is probably going to be filmed at night in the dark. There's no power, that type of thing. And this film does try to establish a lot of the voyeuristic nature that 1974 did. I think it is in many ways a nice love letter to that film. It just wants to incorporate a lot of modern things, but I think some of the modern things now just feels very dated, because that type of stuff you just don't see in films these days, especially the eye pulling, my days. It's nice to have that dual perspective, so we get the audience point of view, and then we get the voyeuristic point of view. And it definitely helps to sell when someone else is in the room, but I think you have to be really careful with these, and films have to be careful when they do any kind of voyeuristic POVs, that they don't just use it for the sake of convenience. Or it's otherwise what happens is that you see that there's a fly in the wall looking into the room, but actually there's no one there, because actually they're just on the other side of the house killing someone, and it kind of feels just put in there for the sake of, having some creepy moving eye imagery. It does kind of remind you of like really, really old horror films, in like Scooby-Doo episodes where like they'd be like the painting on the wall and the eyes are moving. That is nice, and it is pretty creepy, but obviously can't be overdone, and it has to be done in a way that like makes sense. It's otherwise you're establishing like a killer that's in multiple places at once. This film breaks this up instantly with the first kill, which is brutal, it's quick, gets straight to the point. Instead of cutting to black, it cuts to red, which is kind of like a nice sort of twist on that. And that's really good. That's quite impactful and really sets the tone. And obviously it sets the idea of the bag, which was a very big reveal in the first one, but in this film, like, they're obsessed with the bag. It feels like it's almost like referencing the original too hard, where like sometimes you do need to add some like original flavor. It's like, oh, there was a bag reveal in the first one, so now we need to use the bag every time as our main source of weapon, even though we don't know where these bags come from. It's always the same bag. It always looks the same. It's the same size. We're not using different types of bags. We're not using different types of things to suffocate people with. It's the exact same identical bag always in every single like attempt to kill. And it would have been nice to have a bit more variation. The first kill was good, and it really did like set a good tone. And then we get introduced sort of to the rest of the girls who were there staying over for Christmas. We do get a scene where we're introduced to the asylum, where we get introduced to Lent, who obviously is Billy and the original killer from the 1974 version. And in this one, he's sort of locked up away. They talk about how he murdered his family and how he was locked into a child as an adult. All the good makings of a serial killer. And then we get this funny interaction with the Santa Claus and about how like he always tries to escape on Christmas, alluding to what's going to happen. And then it sort of just drops that and cuts away, and we sort of get back to the girls who are staying over for Christmas. So first, to kind of go over like some of the cast, you have Heather, Melissa, Dana Kelly Lee, who is Claire's sister, Claire. And then obviously you have Kyle, who sort of makes an appearance. There's a girl called Eve, who is literally the most pointless character in the whole film. She makes like one quick appearance and is dead. And it is almost pointless having her in the film because she establishes nothing. And then later on we get introduced to Billy's mother and the stepfather and the original father, and obviously Billy. So quite a big cast, and I'm going to be probably pretty terrible at getting all the names right when I'm talking about certain points, but obviously it's a pretty long film and I got a lot to go through, so please forgive me if I get things wrong. So if I'm not mistaken, Heather's played by Mary Winstead, who's in Final Destination 3, along with, is it Yan K. Lowe, who plays Lauren? She was also in Final Destination. These are sort of like some of the big characters, I guess. And there's also Andrea Martin, who plays Barra, who's sort of like the house mother, a character that the 2019 version didn't have, I don't believe. So yeah, these sort of make up like the foundational characters. Claire unfortunately just dies fast, so she didn't really have much to do in this. But Heather, really strong character actually. Dana was pretty strong until she died. Kelly was also pretty strong, and Melissa was all right. I think the saving grace for me was Lee, Claire's sister. When she just arrived, she was just a badass from the beginning, and she was like 100% the most competent person in the room who could do things, more so than Kyle. Like Kyle almost didn't accomplish anything really. So it's kind of nice to see that spin as well. Not always relying on the man to fix situations. Contrary to belief with the 2019 version. And what we start off with is this really nice introduction where they're all sort of sat around the fire, talking and drinking, getting drunk, talking about how much they hate Christmas. And this is a really nice personal setting that kind of like the 1974 version had, and I think it obviously tries to mimic that a little bit. But you really do need this. You do need a way to like show us the faces of who's involved and introduce the characters to this. And which is like a massive 180 compared to the 2019 version, where it felt like the dorm was so big that it never felt like anybody was in the same building at the same time. It was almost like Home Alone, really, where people just like running around a massive house, and it's just like, how did these people even know each other? Like, there's so many rooms, the house is so big, like it's just crazy. Whereas this is a converted house, is what it looks like, into dorms, along with the dorm across the road as well, which we don't get to see anything about, except from like a flashback when you see like there was a family living there many, many years ago. Yeah, this film's more like a house, and these feel more like a family and more like sisters. And obviously they have disdain, whether for each other or for the seasonal events or anything that you're expected to do. It feels more relatable. I like it. And there's kind of this like interesting lecture that goes on where they talk about like how they don't feel comfortable, like how Heather specifically doesn't feel comfortable buying presents for a serial killer who is allegedly dead. Understandable. And obviously she kind of makes a point how like it doesn't seem very Christmassy, and they have this like very like interesting lecture about how Christmas has nothing to do with Christianity and how that kind of has changed over the years. And it's kind of weird. Heather talked about how like buying a present for a serial killer is like worshipping a deity, like a pagan deity, something like that. Kind of bizarre. But then they talk about how like, well, all like Christian traditions are just pagan like traditions, that we've just had Christianity change into like Christian traditions, which is true. Historically that was the easiest way to get people to convert to religion. You just change pre-existing traditions into their traditions. You just, tweak some of the days, tweak some of the names, and it doesn't feel like people are doing massive changes to their life, and then religion spreads very, very easily. But they do have a very interesting conversation about how like, how evil sort of like can just wait in the shadows, and it's ready to kill at any time. How removing the Christian element and the sort of like perfect sort of nicety that goes with it, means that there's always room for danger and always room for bad things to happen. What should be like, religious and festive times, like people murder at Christmas or like, any other holiday, I guess. And I think that's like a really interesting conversation and a really interesting topic when you think about how winter generally, kind of talks about this in like the Krampus review, how winter like is usually like a bad time for people, like historically. A lot of people died over winter, people can't like feed themselves and warm fires and stuff like that. It's generally a terrifying thing, and that's why we have so many cultural practices around this time of year to get us through the dark times. And it's kind of interesting that they have that approach, except they just talk about it as murder. Shortly into this, we get our first introduction to the first phone call, which in many ways is similar to the original, where it's sort of interrupting the nice festivities that are going on, I guess. It's kind of nice how it's done in this one. I think in the original, like, it was played very, very similarly, where most of the conversation happened on the phone and you don't hear what's going on, and then you sort of get introduced to it when things like go on loudspeaker. And this kind of did that as well, I think. And it's kind of nice because I think this is one thing the 2019 version just didn't establish, which is that like texts just aren't creepy. Like texts are not scary. The films like Countdown, like they'll never work because apps are not scary. Texts are not scary. There's no fear or danger from texting someone unless like you text the wrong person the wrong thing. There's no innate fear from this. So you're trying to like manufacture fear that doesn't exist. And usually like to make something horror-wise work, you have to have a nice drawing link about like why this thing can become dangerous or scary. But it was a nice introduction to the phone calls, and every time that they happen, it's creepy. You get to see these nice little background. We get to hear all the audio to the visual footage that we see later on in the film, which is quite nice. But obviously later in the film, when they have the visuals, they add music on top of it, which I think kind of just takes it away a little tiny bit for me. I think without the music, it'd be a little bit better. Gives it more breathing room, and then the audience can think, oh yeah, like this is what I heard on the phone call. Sometimes music can just mask too much reliance on music. It needs to stop. Bear in mind, like I said earlier, this came out in 2006, which was the same year as When a Stranger Calls. So maybe this takes something away from the creepiness, or maybe this adds to the creepiness. Like maybe people were super scared of this back then in 2006, like just randomers ringing you up and freaking you out. But I think it's kind of interesting in a lot of films, actually. Even when you look at Scream, when the development of like phone calls and how phone calls were once like a really suspicious thing, and like, oh, it's kind of weird you're having a phone call with someone random, or like someone's leaving a weird voicemail, or like, why do you have a phone at all? Like phones are really like dubious and spooky, and now like people don't care, and the most we get is like texts, and texts just aren't scary. But I've already said this. After this, we get introduced to Eve, who again, most pointless character ever. All she really does is just reaffirms that Heather's like somewhat religious, because she's just like, oh, I know you like reading the Bible too. Eve is just not only like she's called Eve, but like she visibly looks like the epitome of someone that's never done anything except read the Bible in her entire life. Very weird character. I don't understand this, because it just doesn't like have any implication on what's happening. And then she dies anyway. It seems very bizarre to me as well that they look out the window so many times and they see all these cars, yet, they only notice Eve's car later on when it was convenient. But here we go. That's how films are done these times. But these phone calls do introduce us to Agnes. Agnes was a part of conversations that happened in the 1974 films, but never really like elaborated on anything. Everything was pretty much centered around Billy. This film, for better or worse, introduces Agnes as more of an integral part of the story, and essentially the first part of the murdering spree. I don't know if I kind of like the two tagging sort of serial killer approach now that I think about it. It really feels like they're sort of occupying the same space and the same breathing room, and it becomes very difficult to be scared of an imposing force when there's two of them. It just always feels like people are outnumbered, and it's kind of like unfair. And maybe, I don't know, maybe this works for people, but for me, I didn't really dig it too much. However, it did mean we get a lot of nice backstory and a lot of like filler, which, establishes more of the relationship of what happened with Billy and Agnes and his parents, which obviously was horrendously grim. I'll talk about that in a second. It kind of worked. And then this kind of cut back to Eve, and I don't know if they're trying to like draw some kind of link that these two people were together. I think it was like a red herring, really. Introduce Agnes and then show us Eve, who just stands in a corridor and just is absolutely creepy for no reason. But we do get the flashback of the murder for the family. It was pretty cool. Again, a lot of heavy usage of Christmas lights seems to be like the main source of light in this, which I think is good. The use of Christmas lights means you can use color very creatively. Something that a lot of films don't do these days, using like reds and using blues and stuff like that. It really sets tone and mood. Not a lot of films do that these days because people kind of are used to it. But I appreciate it when people do this. And James Wan kind of did this a bit with Insidious. Introduce a lot of reds to sort of signify when something's bad or dangerous. Yeah, the audience know it and gets it, but it's still nice to see sometime. And I think this does benefit from having a more of an aesthetic approach to a lot of the story that's going on. And obviously in this we learn that Billy's mother kills his father. It appears just to be because she hates the fact that Billy's yellow and has this condition on his liver, which I can't remember if this was even a feature in the first one. I don't know if it was. I mean, the yellow is kind of distracting sometimes, but at least I guess it adds some unique flavor to him and doesn't just make him like a generic killer. I will say though, like the actor they got to play the younger and adult version of Billy were really good. They looked very similar to each other, actually. Quite impressive. You don't get that a lot, especially compared it to Agnes. Like when Agnes grows older, like you can tell that this is some Hills of Eyes like level prosthetic. She almost looks like she's wearing someone else's face. Like she's wearing like a mask. I don't know if this is like an actress with a ton of prosthetics, or if like she's physically just wearing a mask. But it's very bizarre. She almost doesn't look human. She looks more deformed as an adult than she did when she was a child. And I feel like most of the deformities would happen when you're a child. I don't know. I'm no expert in incestual children. So these flashbacks sort of come back and forth quite a lot. You know, we see when Billy murders his parents and his mother after she like has weird incest love. And, you know, I think some of this is kind of like extreme to the point of like pointlessness. I don't know if this is people's like criticism when the film came out, but like making cookies out of flesh, like, okay, yeah, it makes him creepy. It definitely makes him seem unhinged and deserve to be in a mental asylum. But like, does this pay any kind of homage or respect to the character of the first one? I don't know. I can't quite remember if this was. I mean, it's been a while since I watched the original. I was not going to watch it for this because, you know, it's pretty standard what happens. It's not too crazy. I think this film just adds so much to it that I don't know how much of this is really benefiting what's going on. But yeah, I guess it makes him look creepy to be like a cannibal. But of course, what we do learn is that Agnes is alive. We know that she's not like Billy. She wasn't locked away. I think she was probably put in some kind of like weird adoption thing because she was, I guess, more of a victim of this scenario. But obviously Billy took one of her eyes, and that's just weird. But obviously that's just what the film's obsessed with right now. And in a way, this kind of like cements now like what's going on in the actual house. It's like, you know that this killer is now Agnes because it has long hair. It's not Eve. And it has to be Agnes. And I don't know if that just kind of spoils things really, because I think the film tries to like do it as a bit of a reveal. Then it's Agnes, but like physically, who else could it be? But also, how did she get in the house? Where's she been for her whole life? If she's been like adopted or something, like surely she has like a semi-normal life where she's not just like a raging serial killer. It seems kind of weird to me that there's all these like blanks, and for a film that relies a lot on backstory and flashbacks, so it seems kind of weird and convenient that this isn't included. And it's not that I expect everything in horror to be explained. It's just when a film goes out of its way to insert as many flashbacks as possible, as much references to the things that happened in the past, you know, physically showing us instead of just like, you know, talking about something that had happened, it kind of seems just overly convenient then, just to leave specific things out for the sake of not wanting to tell us outright. You know, you can still allude to things subtly without having it being super obvious. You can kind of make a reference to the fact that she's alive, or that she's escaped, or that she did similar things and killed people without physically showing us in a flashback. You know, maybe show us on like a newspaper clipping or something like that, but they never did, so it feels weird and hollow. Again, this is where close sister arrives, Lee. She makes a massive scene. Again, I think she's probably one of my favorite characters in this. I think she makes the biggest impact. She makes the most sense. She's the most competent, and she's very stern, and she goes for it, and she gets it done. And obviously she was dead set on finding her sister, and she has a really nice segment where she talks about like how they've rekindled their relationship and how they're only half sisters, but you know, her younger sister is really like the older sister because she wants to make something work and create a relationship out of nothing, which is kind of nice. And in any way, that's kind of like most of the real character depth that we get from anybody in this. I will say one thing, that a lot of these characters like Melissa and Kelly and like Lauren, very, very bland, like really bland people that don't really do much. You know, even Heather to some degree, even though she was semi our main protagonist until things changed. Very bland characters. Like, you knew she was religious and she was kind of over this, but that's kind of it. And, you know, you could use the campfire a little bit more maybe, just to establish some stuff. But obviously we get to see like this weird side story that's going on about some sex tape plot. Nobody cares about this. Like, literally nobody cares about this plot. Why is it even here? What, to establish that someone's an arsehole? Like, who cares? You can do that anyway, in a million different ways. This put so much emphasis on the sex tape. I don't know if it was just deliberately to find a way to show us more sex. This is probably what it feels like. But this is a slasher film. You don't need excuses or weird plot points to show people a sex scene. It literally happens in every film. It just baffles me that there was so much emphasis on this scene. And I'm going back to this videotape and like, oh my god, you did it, and how many tapes do you have? That's really sick. I think a lot of people back then, had their own personal stash of videotapes from what you can see in films. But as it moves on, we see that I think Billy's now in the house. He's running around, peeping on people. There's a weird thing where he's peeping on Lauren in the shower. This is another little side gripe I have. A lot of films do this, where like when they want to show someone in a shower, they get in, they get a bit wet, and then they get out, as if like that contributes to having a shower, especially if you just vomited on yourself. It's almost like filmmakers don't think that we know what having a shower means and what it entails. Maybe this is just awkward for the actress to do it, but man, at least just throw some shampoo on or something. Like, it just seems so weird to just have a woman stood naked. You got this actress to actually be naked, just to get a bit wet, and then put a towel around her. Like, okay. Like, I'm not asking to see like a full shower scene. It's just like, it's such a weird thing. You don't have to show us this anyway, right? You could show us many things that Billy could do, peeping on people, but you want to show us a shower scene. And we're going to believe that someone's going to go in after throwing up on themselves, get a little bit wet, and they're perfectly spotless. No chance. Anyway, that's just kind of like a little weird side gripe that I had. Moving on. So as the girls become more invested in what's actually going on, we see body counts increase more. We discover, I think it's Melissa's death. We discover Eve as well. And this gets reported to the police. And then we see a bit more stakes of what's going on, right? We get to realize that one person is confirmed dead, 3 people are missing, right? People are actually now paying attention to what's going on, and not just paying attention to like, oh, this person was here an hour ago and now they're not here anymore. Like, yeah, okay. And then we also get to realize the severity of the weather and the fact that they're kind of trapped. So I think this is kind of good. I kind of talked about this in the Krampus, how like seasons and weather is a really good way to like entrap people into a house or a scenario. And it really helps build claustrophobia and tension. The thing literally benefited from this like you would not believe, right? And if you're going to set something at winter, have people trapped in a storm. It just makes sense. It's just so good. Kind of reminds me of like, there's other film as well, the one about the crocodile, which was like stuck because of floods. Stuff like that. It's good. Natural disasters and natural like weather incidents like this provide its own level of horror outside of like what's physically happening, right? Because there's real consequences to being out in the cold, especially if it's in minus temperatures. So we're deciding on whether they're going to stay or leave. Billy interrupts us anyway, murdering people. He murders Heather in the car, which I think was quite a surprise. With her being like a lead role in Final Destination, it's kind of interesting to see her killed off actually. And the house mother dies as well, accidentally, with the icicle, which I think is the most creative kill and most surprising kill in the film, actually. Totally didn't expect that. This is something I kind of thought about as well, just a random side note. When you think about like a lot of horror films that are set in winter and like in the cold and stuff like that, like an icicle is not like a really good weapon. Like, doesn't your evidence not just like melt? Anyway, so the ending is just a massive showdown between Agnes and Billy, where they're sort of fighting in the attic with Lee and I believe it's Kelly. Yeah, it's pretty standard. Standard weird brawl, obsessing with eyes, pulling eyes out, eating eyes. The eyes just blur everywhere. Like, it's just so like overdone at this point in the film. But they create a fire. They get trapped in the fire. You think they're dead. Obviously, they're not dead. They're in the hospital. And then Billy and Agnes are just surprise we're here and try and kill the 2 main characters. Also, this is just another example of just obscene things that happen in films. Like the fact that she's like banging on that door and she breaks the window and there's a nurse right next to her that just does not react. It's crazy. Billy's then chasing her down the corridor like with a knife. Doesn't even notice that he's doing this. This known serial killer. Crazy. And then Billy like falls off the edge and dies. And it's like story over. Yeah. Pretty average ending. But I will say, the film is not bad. I think it probably just suffered from the time that it came out, some weird choices that it made, and the fact that it kind of had a very weird, convoluted plot. But for the most part, it was actually pretty good. You know, a lot of the horror was really good. The kills and the jump scares were decent. They were overdone. They weren't overused. And it really did have some actual moments of horror that was pretty good. I think it just overly relied on the gnarliness of pulling out eyes. Like, anyway, moving on, we're going to talk about the real horror show now, which is the 2019 version. Holy moly. So, let's get into this. Oh man, make a strong cup of tea because this is a tough one.
I am just saying that she might want to get involved because she understands that if we let men get away with this sort of behavior...
She is right here, you guys.
Let men get away with this sort of behavior, then they'll get away with everything.
We already do.
I thought we were sisters. No? Fine. I get it. You guys don't want to fight the good fight. You don't want to confront the white supremacist patriarchy head on.
Split a snickerdoodle with me?
No, nope. It's fine. I get it.
So I know that this came out, and I saw some of the trailers before this came out, and it didn't really fill me with much enthusiasm, so I never watched it. So for the purpose of this episode, I watched it, considering the fact that this came out like 2 years ago, and I can totally say that I regret doing this. But it's nice to know that my initial instinct about films looking at trailers is right. So the film opens with a quote, and this quote is the entire film in a nutshell. You can pause it after the first, minute, and you've watched the whole film. So the quote is as follows, and it's from the supposed founder of the college that they go to. Man possesses power so formidable they can only be considered supernatural. With proper education, men can wield these powers and go forth in the world. Okay. You know straight away from this that it's going to be setting up some weird kind of cult, some weird kind of supernatural element, and some kind of commentary on men's involvement in the world. This already has nothing to do with Black Christmas. It has nothing to do with the 1974 version. It's got nothing to do with the 2006 version. This is an entirely new beast in itself, and my days, it is a mess. So the first girl gets stalked outside, and she is trying to talk to people on a phone, texting, and she thinks it's the guy behind him. This was, although this and the kind of kill and the killer that appears in multiple places, proper Halloween sequel version, Maya's just appearing in random places. Aside from this craziness, I didn't hate it. I think what it did do is establish a really good sense of real fear that's actually really modern and applies to a lot of people, which is the fear of not only events that happen on college campuses in America, but also the general fear of being stalked and people following you home. There's a lot of talk already, even here in the UK, about people not being able to get safe Ubers home or safe taxis home from nights out, and they end up being abducted or taken or drugged or in some way kind of used. This is a very modern thing even today, even 2 years on from this film. This is really good commentary, and I wish the film relied a lot more on this. It might have got away with a lot of its messages a lot more by talking about the random nature of random violence. I mean, if anything, the 1974 version was an act of random violence. It was just so happened that these girls were living in his house. And in many ways, it just so happens that Laurie Strode came across Michael. A lot of the acts of random violence are more scary than something that feels premeditated and in some way a punishment. Because when you introduce the element of punishment, you have to introduce the element of justification for that punishment. And if you don't sell people on the justification of punishment, you'll never sell people on the idea that these people should be punished. And therefore, you can't establish real horror in that. Because really, although some sympathetic natures in killers can make them more scary because they're more relatable, that in itself provides its own horror. Also having people who are so void of human morality and empathy and sympathy for people void of all this stuff, like, can be equally creepy in their own right. And the film kind of like needs to decide which it wants to be. But if it's going to rely on the sympathetic nature of killers, it has to be relatable. Unfortunately, not everybody relates to the messages that are going on in this film, especially not in 2021, especially not in 2019. It's very, very bizarre. So as we get introduced to these characters, the big thing we noticed, or at least I noticed, is this campus property that they're on is massive. This could make any killer easily dodge anybody. Like, they'd probably spend so much more time trying to find them. There's actually no real horror going on because they don't know where they are. This is the first, I think, fundamental issue of this film. Claustrophobic natures when it comes to serial killers and serial nature is so much more better than having like a big open space, because there is so many places to hide that it requires some kind of supernatural element to just know instinctively like where people are in a room and where people are in like a massive building. And it also means there's no close nature for these people, right? How do these people ever come together when there's so many people? Like, how do you know anybody, even if you spent a year there? How do you know anyone in some capacity when a building is that big with so many people in it? And bear in mind, most of the people in this film had gone home, right? And there's already still so many people. I mean, the girls were one thing. Don't even get me started on the boys' dorm, whatever that is. There's so many boys left behind. Like, what, all the freshers just never went home? Like, that's just bizarre to me. Because all these, like, convicted killers were freshers. So, but anyway, we're still going to lessons, even though people have gone home, which doesn't make sense. But then the first lecture is some massive, generic, misogynist teaching about, like, how basically men are nothing without women, and that men basically create the world that women are in, and yeah. And then obviously he asks, like, oh, is this a man or a woman who asked this? And, you know, he asked the main character, who didn't put her hand up, you know, chosen at random, very cliche thing to do in films. And she said, oh, it was a man. I said, oh, you know, it's like, oh, it's a woman. You know, you can't just assume writing has a gender, which I totally get. You know, and it's actually a very, very valid point to make that in all major justice movements, you know, whether it's women's rights, LGBTQ rights, whether it's black rights, okay, there are people within that community who have the opposing opinion, right? Because they don't want to get involved in the change and fear of their own safety. This was a completely valid thing. You know, not all women in America, in the UK, and other countries got involved in, like, the suffragette movement. Like, just didn't happen. And it's because there was a real fear of what would happen when you start challenging the system that, you know, influences your life. And it was only because of brave people who did these things that real change eventually happened. But, you know, there were people opposing this. There were women who were probably opposing the suffragette movement. There was probably people of colour and different sexualities opposing the movements as well. You know, it's very normal. It's common. It happens today. It doesn't mean that it's right. That people should have, you know, a sort of self-destructive mentality about their own well-being. But you can't blame people when it might mean the difference between surviving or not in the world that we're in. And anyway, there were some vague comments to the culture war, highlighting that, you know, men are the people who create culture. And then there was some weird reference to ritual sacrifice to pagan gods when they're disobedient, you know, and talking about, like, white supremacy, patriarchy, and all that kind of stuff. You know, every, like, buzzword you can imagine was thrown into, like, a couple of sentences. And it's kind of interesting because the 2006 version taught about the pagan relations of Christmas, which, you know, this could have made a nice reference to as well. No, it's not interested. In fact, this film is so disinterested in Christmas that it is not only not a horror film, it's not a Christmas film in any way. The Christmas element is just convenient plot timing. You know, it just happens to be at Christmas. And then the horror has nothing to do with this film because it is so disinterested in being scary and in inflicting any kind of horror, because it's so wrapped up in its own messaging. It fails to establish both things that this film is meant to be. And you really have to think, is this stuff needed in a film? Is this the writers or directors? Bear in mind, the director also wrote part of this as well, making their own personal beliefs known throughout a film. You know, and don't get me wrong, this type of commentary is important, and films have been made that have influenced generations with its social commentary on various aspects of life. When it's inserted into a film like this, it can make the film feel really uncomfortable. there can be films that are set up on specific natures. So you can talk about like specifically like women's rights as an example. It's films like this that exist. And they'll give so much more time and fleshing out of characters that make the storytelling that it's trying to do and the messaging that it's trying to do hit home harder. Because it has a way in for the audience to relate to these people and to drive those messages home harder. Whereas this does not have this. It's all very shallow, pointing at general buzzwords and trigger words of conversations that are happening right now. And it makes it feel really, really awkward. And horror films have been the pinnacle place, especially when it comes to women's rights and women's like equality with men. Women are on equal footing to men, and in many ways, especially in slasher films, women overcome men and overcome oppressive, usually sexually driven violence, and establish their own independence and freedom again. And this film wanted to introduce that, right? The main character was raped, and it doesn't achieve that because it's getting the wrong messages involved. It's biting off more than it can chew, basically. So I might be getting a bit too carried away in my frustrations of things that are going on, where I'm not necessarily going more into depth about like the people who are in this. So the main character is Riley, played by Imogen Poots. I've seen her in some things before. I think she's pretty good as an actress, and I think she's pretty good in this film. I actually really liked her in this film, to be honest. Chris, who's played by Elise Shannon. She is the core of all the, I guess you call it social justice warrioring in this film, and in many ways just makes her incredibly unlikable as a person. Marty, played by Donna Hugh. Yeah, she was alright. She was pretty average. She felt the more typical slasher side character. Do you know what I mean? Jessie, played by Brittany O'Grady. Hilarious. She was my favourite. 100% my favourite. Every like line that she delivered was just not only funny, but like really well delivered. Landon, played by Caleb Eberhardt. Pretty good. Pretty like average guy. I don't know if I don't know if the film's just using him to show that not all guys are bad. I don't know. Professor Gilson, who did the lecture, played by Carrie Elwes. Such a shame that he's in this film. He's such a good actor, and when you think about like the things that he did with like Saw and other films, I have fond memories of him being in Liar Liar with Jim Carrey, and just to see him being in a film like this just really makes me sad. The rest of the characters, not interesting. Nobody cares about them. Really, really just do not care about them. They're just absolutely just boring, generic teenage characters. Nowhere near of any interest. So what this film sort of really lacks is any kind of nuance and any kind of subtlety that it's actually kind of insulting to look at. Okay? Like, to assume that the teachers and all these men are not involved when all the paintings on the walls are identical to Professor Gelson, whatever his name is, other people, like, it's obviously them. And he literally says in the class, like, there's no secret cult meetings. What's more cult than having paintings of yourself on a wall, like, for real? And it even introduced like this weird like fraternity cult meeting, and it's just so obvious like who's there. It's so obvious that the teacher's there. Like, that reveal is not even a reveal at the end. It's just not. And it's a shame because all the stuff is just so pathetic when the film could make some pretty decent commentary these days, especially when you think about like, okay, what would a modern day slasher want to make commentary on? Well, I guess the most terrifying thing to teenage girls may be rape cultures on college campuses in America. Okay, the fear like the introduction did, right? People walking behind you and stuff. That's so much more interesting than just like showing you like a barragement of people dressed in black hoods. And especially because this film talks about like how, when Riley reported her rape, the police didn't believe her, no one believed her, everyone's like actively against her. And then I guess this kind of results because they were setting up this like performance, and Riley was the coordinator, and she knew the words and she knew all the stuff about it because basically it was her song about her because her rapist was going to be there for this performance. And they did what I can only describe is the most weirdest performance I have ever seen in a film in my entire life. Not only like was the choreography not that good, the song wasn't good. Nobody could sing. Everything was awkwardly out of time to the music. It almost felt like they'd been ADR'd to death. Like everything was just recorded separately and then they were just mouthing over the words. It was just really weird and kind of uncomfortable to watch. And then the reactions that the crowd were doing just void all logic. Like, I get the argument to say that, like, you know, not all guys are like this, not all guys are rapists, and it's wrong to, like, assume that. Obviously, it is. But at the same time, like, to be sat in this performance and throwing paper airplanes, like, people, like, offended because, like, you know, their rapist tendencies are being questioned on stage and that, like, they can't just live some weird, crazy frat culture. Like, what is this film trying to do at all? And it feels really, really weird to see this, especially in a slasher, like, film. I guess what makes this really awkward to watch is, in slashers, it was all about doing and not saying. You know, compare this to, like, Last House on the Left, okay? When you're in a situation where someone gets, like, brutally attacked or murdered, okay? That's like a revenge film. So the plan there is you go back and you get that instant justice, right? But to think that, like, you could have the same kind of grittiness or real kind of, like, horror when your only, like, fight back to this type of, you know, assault is through petitions and, like, trying to get people fired because of things that they're teaching. You know, I get it makes a lot of common social commentary and things that are happening, like, at the moment, but, you know, the whole, like, cancel culture and the culture wars and all that kind of stuff, but, like, that does nothing for a horror film. It really doesn't. It doesn't add any tension, no horror, no nothing. And it makes things really awkward because what things like Last House on the Left showed was that, like, when women are hit with brute force, that they can respond with brute force, right? So it's like, you killed my friends, I'm gonna kill you. There's no, like, I'm gonna just go away and, like, make a petition about it. Or, like, you know, some other random rubbish like that. It feels like it is a social commentary film masked as a horror film, and there's just nothing else there. Just cheap jump scares, maybe once or twice, and that's it. It's just crazy. You don't need to remake the wheel. Although the wheel is kind of generic, some structures are important, especially when it comes to slasher films. Some things are there because they need to be there, and the key part of it is the final girl. Like, maybe this is overdone, but, like, it is a key integral part. And the reason is because you need that growth as a character for someone to no longer become the victim, but instead to become their own version of justice. But we don't get that in this film because it's a shared responsibility. It's a shared thing amongst many girls to just take down as many boys as possible. And it seems bizarre because most of those guys didn't do anything in this except knock on the floor with a stick. Talk about tarnishing with the same brush. But there's things that you could have done with this to make things interesting and to make things modern. You know, a modern take on slasher that could have worked. You know, she clearly had some kind of PTSD, some kind of nightmares about this. Relying on the PTSD is, you know, a more interesting angle. You know, maybe she's not a perfect final girl. Maybe she's one who makes mistakes. She kills the wrong people. But at least she's having some kind of growth, and at least she's physically doing something about it. But instead in this, like, everything feels justified no matter what. And I think it's a really good, like, something like the nightmares and the PTSD and the flashbacks and stuff, like, it's a really good emotional tool that can drive narrative, it can drive character development. But if we start introducing, like, plot points into dreams, like, that is weak weak writing. It means that the script is more focused on what it's trying to talk about the social commentary, and less about what's going on in the actual film. And that's something I felt like happened with these dream sequences. We saw, like, weird, I don't know, symbols and flashes of, like, some kind of weird cult. You know, how is she meant to know this? This has nothing to do with the relevance of her life if she was a normal person. And yet, it is strong-armed into this film because the film doesn't actually want to set up this as a plot point. Anyway, as the film goes on, they do get a phone call, which kind of references to the original films, but it just turns out to be a normal phone call after all this like creepy noise happens. And I couldn't help but laugh. The reason why I laughed is because it reminds me of that sketch. I think it's from Scary Movie 2 or 3. There's like Pamela Anderson and that other woman, and it kind of mimics The Ring, and it's like this creepy voice. It's like 7 days and all that kind of stuff, and she's like, wait, what? And it turns out it's just her mum, just with a creepy voice, and like literally it's just the girl's mum in this. Like, it's literally the same gag. But we do get a really hilarious interjection in this from Jessie. Again, I think my favourite character in this, where she's just like, do I just turn the oven on and put the ham in? It seems too easy. Like, it's just dumb. It's good. It's like the typical like dumb character, except the actual good spin is that they're not blonde and they're not like white, and you know, you keep the same tropes but just change things up. It's a bit more of a dynamic way to do things than kind of like just poke at it for like an hour and be like, oh, this is wrong, we shouldn't do this. But what's really bizarre is like when things escalate and get worse, like she's so happy to just call security over her friend who's been missing for a day than she is the fact that she's getting like creepy texts from someone on campus after being raped. And this is again another thing to me that just does not make sense. I feel like if you've been a recent victim of someone on site who lives close to where you live, you'd be reporting those texts instantly, and you'd not be waiting for your friends disappearing, which may never ever happen. It only happens in the context that we know that it's a horror, but in real life that would never happen. The texts are a much more reasonable point in time where you'd make that type of call to security on campus, and people might actually believe a bit more, you know. And she like explained this to the security in like the worst way possible. She kind of like made it sound like she couldn't even speak, like she didn't even know what happened. It makes you sound crazy. All she had to say was like, look, I got raped and some creep is texting me. Can we have a look at like who this could possibly be, like who's still on campus, that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be hard. But all these DMs and stuff, like, it's just another point where it tried to overly modernize things into a way that's just not creepy. Texts are not scary. If someone texts me saying, I'm going to kill you in 3 days, I'd be like, alright, mate. See you later. Weirdo. Very, very bizarre. But alas, they go to the boys' dorm, I guess. I can't remember the name of the Greek letters. I'm not even going to try and care that I remember. And they bump into the teacher, Mr. Gelson, apparently the only teacher who exists in this entire school. And the film makes this really crazy thing where it tries to highlight the fact that he has a list, and it's like making it super suspicious, and like, you know, the music, and it's like, oh, I have to leave and that kind of stuff. Like, I think it's pretty reasonable. Obviously, like, hindsight, we know that list like had a purpose, but you know, in the moment, like, it is completely reasonable that if a teacher is still on campus, that they're gonna have a list of other people who are still on campus in case something happens to those people. You know, I think that's just a general point of security, is it not? I think it's completely reasonable, but it doesn't help that like everything that he says is so weird and creepy and comes across as like, yes, I definitely have ulterior motives, that it feels completely justified, and when it should just be like a really like generic and normal thing. Like, I don't understand why it's wrong. So they might introduce more fun lectures of men versus women, and I think this is pretty boring school to be at, I guess, if they're going to talk about one subject. And again, it's because we're only introduced to one teacher and one dynamic of teaching in the school, and I can't imagine a reason why anybody would pay for their kids to go to a school that only teaches this and calls it the classics. You know, I think if there's one thing I can say for sure, which is that Chris's character was absolutely right when she said these aren't my classics. I mean, these aren't my classics either. I don't think it has anything to do about colour or anything about any of the characteristics. Like, who the hell teaches this stuff these days? I mean, I've not been to a private school, but maybe this is more commonplace in other places. I don't know. So anyway, finally, some killings happen, and for some unknown, ungodly reason, it's with a bow and arrow. When is the last time a bow and arrow ever been scary in a horror film? Like, I cannot imagine I have no idea. I don't know who came up with this idea. A bow and arrow is not scary. I mean, yeah, I guess maybe if you want to make references to like hunting and how this is kind of like maybe like a white male privilege that they go out hunting all the time. I mean, who cares? Women hunt all the time, especially in America. You know, I've seen the pictures. I don't live there, but I've seen the pictures. I don't think it's just like an exclusive thing. I don't understand why the bow and arrow is a choice. It's not a scary weapon. A knife is scary. A bow and arrow is not. And the reason is because a knife is going to be very hard to miss when you're up close to someone. But bow and arrow, you have to keep distance, and you're more likely to miss because people just run. Like, what's the point? And also, they then like run away, and it's like 3 versus 1. Like, just jump on him. But instead, like, she gets slightly scratched by an arrow, and it's like, oh, we need to tend her wound. Like, what wound? That is not going to incapacitate you. Not enough to like jump on him and like just kill him. I think this is like the big fundamental issue with this film specifically, which is the scale is too big. The dorms are massive. The building is massive. There's too many people involved. There's too many potential killers. So that any time anyone comes on screen, they're a potential suspect. That's, I mean, yeah, if you want to set it up that way, you know, Scream does that very, very well, but that's not what we're doing here, right? It's very obvious that it's the men, because we've already seen the weird cult frat initiation ceremony. We know what it is already. The film hands it to you on a plate. It's like, these are the killers. It's all the men. And the killer's so obviously a person from the school that it takes away any kind of mystery, stranger danger that the original film had. Like, you know that it's actually not a stranger. It might not be someone you know very well, because, like, you know, the college is super big, but, like, you know it's someone there. You've probably seen them in a corridor. Like, it's not crazy. And, you know, the plot just heavy hands everything. You just know that there's a cult involvement in everything, and that there's no mystery in the school like the original. There's no, like, story of serial killers. There's no, like, people who potentially could come back and get you. It's like, you know, the people are already there. It's just, it's weird. And we're in this situation now where, like, even though the stranger danger stuff from the original might seem very outdated because it was quite a big thing in the 70s, like, it is a thing that, like, has a ripple effect through multiple generations. You know, even now, we like I said earlier, we're still talking about the dangers of being around strangers, and, you know, people don't even trust their neighbors anymore. Like, you can still use this plot message to drive home the story, but the film just doesn't, because it just wants to focus on cults and other weird things. And I can't imagine that anyone would be terrified in this scenario except rich, privately educated, pompous twats. Genuinely. It feels more like a bunch of rich kids having their, like, perfect holiday break disrupted by a killer. You know, how dare they inconvenience my time with these people, than it does, like, them genuinely being in danger and in fear for their life, and it being, like, a massive relatable thing. Like, no, like, this just doesn't happen to people. Anyway, so they get chased. For some unknown reason, the killer shoots the car and not the tire. Again, clearly being possessed doesn't mean that you're smart. Clearly they're brain dead as well. And then we've now gone straight into this, like, weird magic element of the story, where, like, everything just is now explained by magic. It's just black magic. That's all it is. I mean, they didn't even make a social commentary on that. I mean, if we're going to go down that road, like, is this not appropriating, like, other cultures? Like, I don't know. Like, it becomes a thing where you start opening Pandora's box. You know, it's... Instead, you're only telling the messages that you want to tell, which is counterintuitive to telling those messages. I don't know. I'm at a point where I'm kind of ad-libbing this because I'm just so in disbelief by this film. It's crazy. And it makes it worse as well. Like, Riley has this bizarre situation where she, where her, like, ongoing weapon is her walking around with this, like, snow shovel, which is so clearly made of plastic. Like, how is this going to hurt anyone? Take off the shovel and, like, file down the wood of it like you did earlier. You know, it also would be less awkward to carry, more practical to use, and just doesn't look ridiculous. I don't understand this. I mean, this is where my notes get thin, because I think, like, genuinely not much happens. It's quite interesting. They make some random weird reference to this black magic being the founder, the guy who did the quote at the beginning, and he's drawing out your true alpha. Ah, yes, the alpha male. That's another social talking point that's ridiculous. And I get it. It's talking about some frat culture of like false masculinity, toxic masculinity, this false idea of like what being an alpha male is in society. But it just sounds ridiculous hearing it out loud in a film. Like, it's kind of different from like people having conversations online about this and like a horror film using it as a plot point. It feels weirdly Scooby-Doo. It really does. So, we've been going through this together for a long time now, and we've had to grit through this film, but we're going to quickly talk about the ending now, and then we can finally just lay this to rest. So we get to the ending of the film, and Riley and Chris confront Professor Gilson, the leader of this cult, in trying to put an end to this by doing what Riley should have done 15 minutes earlier and push over that statue. So we then have the situation where the founder spirit, I guess, appears, and Riley is now stuck with her, I believe, rapist from before. And we're put in a situation where she needs to, like, submit. They talk about kind of what I mentioned earlier, this idea that, like, some women just help men by submitting and being obedient, which I've already explained is a totally valid thing. This totally happens in history. And I think it's actually a really interesting plot point that they got to rely a bit more on. What happened was the most shocking statement I think I've ever heard in a film in my entire life. I actually, like, gasped. And I said, wow, out loud. And I wrote it down in my notes. I said, wow, in capital letters. He said that, like, Riley needed to kneel before him, right? Or she would die, basically. And he said, it's your body, it's your choice. Or something along those lines. And I was just absolutely perplexed that this was said in this kind of way. I mean, like, the film never made any references to children or having babies or, like, abortions. And I know that's another big talking point. And the whole your body, your choice is a completely valid argument. And I don't want to get involved in that whole, like, drama about it. But obviously, I am absolutely shocked that it was framed in this way. The fact, what it kind of felt like was, we're taking a very actually separate issue to what's going on right now. That's, got a lot of vulnerable victims as a point of it. And now we're saying, like, men just weaponize this argument now and can just apply it to anything. That is just absolutely crazy. It just baffles me that it was used in this way. And considering this is written and directed by women, essentially, it's really hard to not separate this as being, like, some really bitter commentary on what's going on. And I think, to be fair, in the film, like, it had some okay moments of sort of balance where they try to argue the other side and in support of men. And I thought, okay, well, at least the film's being somewhat balanced about this. But this is so unhinged, and this is so, like, off the wall. I was really, really shocked. And then when it comes to, like, trying to break this stupid statue, Professor Gilson says, like, if you break us, you break yourself, or something like that. And what is this film saying anymore? At this point, by the end of the film, I was so confused about what this film was even saying. Is this saying that if we destroy frat boy culture, rapists, white supremacy, all the things this thing was setting up, we're somehow destroying women? Destroying women's rights? Destroying women's place in society? Like, now, what are we even talking about? This just becomes really confusing. Maybe I have missed something, and maybe someone who is watching this can enlighten me into what's going on, but I feel like we're now so far away from even what the initial nonsense was about that I don't understand where we are anymore. And so the film wraps up I guess like all the boys die because they burn the house down. At least that kind of happened in the last Black Christmas. And then we just like cut to credits. It's just done. It's just over. Like whatever that was, it's just happened. This film is terrible. It is absolutely terrible. And it actually feels quality-wise, story-wise, and sort of narrative-wise, very similar to the types of things they talk about, like, on, like, the Sabrina series on Netflix. And, like, there was another series as well that was literally talking about cults in, like, schools and stuff. I can't remember what it was. I feel this plot has been done a million times on Netflix. It's just recycling the same stuff. And to drag Black Christmas through the mud like this is unforgivable. I think this might actually be the most insulting remake that has ever existed of a horror film in my entire life. I'm very upset by this. Anyway, it's over. Thank you very much for listening and persevering for this hour. It is just me again. I will be working on some collaboration soon. It's just getting people available. It takes some time. You know what I mean? Final verdicts for these. The 1974 film, I will give a 4 out of 5. The 2006 version, I will give a 4 out of 5. And the 2019 version, I will give a fat 0 out of 5. It is horrendously intolerable in every way. But yeah, that's it. Please do check out any links below, especially to the link tree. That'll take you wherever you need to be. Check out the YouTube. I uploaded a video on Saturday last week. We did the review of the Child's Play series. Just a quick one, nothing super in depth. It's just thrown out there because it's something that I'd seen and I wanted to talk about, but I didn't want to dedicate like a whole podcast to because I would literally be here for hours. So the quicker I could summarize it, the better. And it means I get to put something on YouTube and have that element as well. A bit of an announcement here as well. So I'm not going to be making an episode for next week. I'm going to be having some chill time for the holidays and also getting prepared for January. January is going to be pretty big. We're going to cover all the Scream franchise. So we're going to be covering the first and second film together, back to back, on the 4th of January, which is the first week, on the Tuesday. We'll also then be covering Scream 3 and 4 on the 11th, the week after, back to back. And then on the 18th, which will be after when Scream 5 releases, where we'll do a review of Scream 5 and talk about that on the podcast as well, which will be a lot of fun. I might do also a small YouTube video just reviewing that as well because it's recent and it'll be nice and fun to talk about. Because no doubt I'll be very hyped and probably watch it more than once, as I usually do. Yeah, thank you all very, very much for listening again. I'll see you all in the next episode. Have a nice holiday season. I'll see you in the next one.